Welcome to Innovating Clinical Trials, the podcast designed for clinical research professionals eager to deepen their understanding of clinical trials through concise, insightful segments. Join your hosts, Liam Eves and Ted Traffer, as they uncover the core issues in clinical research, reflect on the industry, and challenge conventional wisdom.
Welcome back to part 2 of the interview with Scott Burgher. In part 1, we talked about why recruitment keeps missing its deadlines. In this episode, we go further into why broken site economics appears non-performing in the data, and what a real feedback loop between sponsors and sites actually looks like. Let's jump in.
What's really interesting is that the fact that healthcare and research are diametrically opposed, right? In which that you think about research patients from a recruitment perspective, patients, you've got to go out and find those patients. When healthcare, they come to you because there's a concern, right? Then I think what's also really interesting is the timing of those interactions as well, not just from the patient's perspective, but also from the healthcare perspective, because the patient may be coming at a time where their symptoms are exactly what is needed for research, but the researcher also has to have that trial in the front of their mind, and there be potentially no other option, solutions, whatever it may be, to be involved. Equally, the patient may not come to them, but the doc has that trial in front of mind. So it's like this, you have to have the perfect storm in order to be engaged in the particular, or potentially engaged in the trial, because two things have to be right. Patient has to be coming at a point where they're going to be suitable and interested. And secondly is that the healthcare provider needs to have that trial in front of the mind, right? So I think it's interesting because it's not a singular problem, right? It's quite multifaceted in the intersection of both patient and healthcare provider.
Yeah, and I think I think you're absolutely right. And just thinking through from a technology perspective, the technology that's used for clinical trials is completely separated from what's used at a physician's office. And so if we're now thinking through how do we really do this, there almost has to be some level of integration of, hey, we're in your office, we're in your medical records. Not only have we identified that this patient is qualified based on us kind of scraping in the background, but we're going to make this part of your workflow to refer this patient to the clinical trial and make sure that all their information is provided appropriately. And so we're talking about massive partnerships at a commercial level that are way beyond my pay grade. But essentially, if you're thinking about what's best for the patient, that's really what we're talking about, right? So, a doctor or their staff is logging into their system. They're looking at the upcoming appointments for the day. They're planning appropriately. Patient gets flagged. Hey, you've got this patient coming in and they're really 98% qualified for this clinical study that, by the way, you have nothing to do with or you've never heard of. Here's all the information you need. And if you click here, it's going to refer that patient to the physician that is the PI and site that, it closest to you. Or, hey, maybe because you've got a bolus of patients that are qualified for this, you actually want to be a PI on this study. Here's how you do that. And maybe then they get activated as a site, which, and here's a button to do that. And we're talking about this connection between the two. And I know there's a slew of regulatory considerations and nuances that we've got to consider. The technology has to be speaking to each other. There's obviously the competitive nature of, well, who gets access to that? And what if there's competing? Great. Let's think through all of these questions. But this is what we as an industry should be focused on. If we're really calling ourselves patient-centric, or even if we want to say we're also site-centric and we care about the site. Well, these are things that we've got to be talking about and furthering science for the patients, for the sites, for human beings, and not necessarily for a profit.
The core problem is that the industry treats recruitment as more of a marketing function, and really asks the question that, how do you find patients at the top of the funnel? And that's really a category error. The real value isn't filling the top of the funnel, although it is, of course, massively important. It's about how you move those patients all the way through it and supporting the sites to do that. So it's more of an enrollment solution. It's not necessarily a marketing one. And I think that because it's filed as marketing, it sits as at the bottom of the hill. All the decisions that actually determine whether you can recruit, so the inclusion, exclusion criteria, the site economics, the intersections and points with the healthcare system, they all get made upstream by other groups, and the recruitment just inherits whatever constraints then roll downhill. It's there to receive the protocol, not to shape it. So I think it does need a seat at the table. And if enrollability was treated as a real input to protocol design, you'd be asking a different question. So like, what's the impact on the protocol itself? And I think for me that's really the shift from recruitment as the thing you do after the protocol's locked to enrollment as something that informs it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Liam, I think we've spoken about this perhaps offline a couple times. Something that I did early in my patient recruitment days was we ran mock trials. And so it wasn't only from is this headline working? Is this ad working? But what about after the patient clicks on an ad? Are they getting through to the secondary pre-screening? Are the conversations there working? And, if they pass that secondary pre-screening, let's get them to a mock site. And, they've got to be in a waiting room, and they've got to fill out paperwork and sign, informed consent. And they've got to sit in an infusion chair for 4 hours. And I did this maybe 15 years ago, where we literally ran end to end in different locations with different patient demographics, just to capture not only the patient, journey. What would they recommend from the infusion chair with 4 hours? I'm only willing to stay 3 hours because I can't afford childcare that long, to the, even the site staff of, I can't sit there with a patient. My shift ended, and now I'm transferring this patient to somebody else who didn't even know this patient's on the trial or who this patient is. And, what information needs to pass between those two site staff. And so I think, just touching upon two things that you said there, it's really looking at it from an early stage of, before they lock that protocol, and understanding how do we impact the protocol, not only to get our data points, but to make sure that we are taking the entire patient journey into consideration, that we're considering things outside of the science. This person's life is impacted. They're doing all of this on behalf of this study. What can we do to help them? But also from a site perspective, and, Liam, you mentioned the site economics. Well, they're broken, right? Sites are asked to invest in staff and training and infrastructure well before they receive any payment. So now what? So now you've got these high-performing sites that are excited to be on the study. They learn all about it. They learn, how to administer the study drug. They're sold on it. They drank the juice, right? And now they're working, and 3, 4, 5 months go by. They haven't received a single payment. And now what? They've invested all this time. So there's a structural problem, right? That's not a performance problem, but what does that show up like on the data? That's a non-performing site. They haven't done anything. Well, now they're going to stop recruiting for your study. They might not take on any future studies because they say, this is not worth our time. We need our offices to be open to paying patients. And so, to me, that's a big issue. And so if we're really taking this human-centric approach of not only interviewing them and, trying to get their buy-in of what would make this study easier for you, but then implementing those changes and that feedback to them that here's what we're doing because we heard you. A lot of times you might make a change and it might not translate the way that site or even that patient thinks that they requested it. And so how do you have that feedback loop? How do you share that information back to them? And so there's obviously technology associated with all this, but again, I'm just going to bring it back to, there's a human aspect here that is really necessary. And so when I think about AI, I think it's being oversold and people are scared they might lose their jobs. But I think we've got to really look at it as something that is not replacing the human, but it's something that's helping from a decision support, not a decision-making aspect. And so whether that is from recruiting directly, identifying patients, or even supporting sites, it's how do we utilize this to make everyone's life easier, not to replace each of us in our own respective jobs.
Yeah, I like when you started talking about the feedback loop, and because I don't think that happens enough. Have you ever seen it be really successful where a sponsor, CRO, plans for the feedback loop and really actions it during the course of a trial?
Yeah, I've when I was at Continuum Clinical, we had a really strong site support team.
Mhm.
And so we were not CRAs. This was different than that, where we really built a relationship with sites to help them not only recruit patients, but just get better and to ease the burden on them. And so we periodically did those interviews, what's working? Are we referring too many patients? Are there too many screen fails? And you want us to update our online pre-screener. And so they didn't feel like we were a big brother. And just basically saying, hey, you haven't enrolled a patient in X months. But it was more about what can we do to support you? What can we do to update our process? And so when we received information where we could change, where we could improve based on it, we not only did it, but we then used those agents that were building those relationships with the sites to let them know that we were doing it. We sent out a written communication. This was pre-COVID, and there were times where, we would send those agents out to the site. They'd spend, a week there. They could be helping mine the site's database to look for patients, flag patients that are coming in for just regularly scheduled visits, but then provide that back to them. And so there's always an element of, certain sites just don't have time and they don't have the resources to focus on your study, to be able to have these conversations in addition to actually working on the study.
Yeah.
But there are sites that are really receptive to it and really appreciative. And there are sites that have recommended working with these types of teams on other studies because they really felt the support and they didn't feel that it was a watchdog and that they were just being criticized for things that they didn't do well, but really supported in a way to help them enroll and really be a tremendous asset to the study.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because it just doesn't happen enough. And I think sponsors a lot of times don't appreciate how much motivation and momentum at the clinical trial site impact recruitment. And so, you mentioned about budgets earlier and payments. And one of the things that's absolutely not accounted for in clinical trials is when things don't go right. So the coordinator's in the room with the patient, they've got the tablet and it doesn't function. And the impact that has not just on that patient visit, but on recruitment as a whole. Because if a coordinator is frustrated with the technology that's being used and can't get things quickly resolved, not only does it disrupt their entire day, often if it's a repeat problem, they'll just turn their attention to another trial that's maybe doesn't have those challenges. So yeah, I think that, and that's never taking into consideration in a clinical trial budget sense. If it is addressed, it's like a small token amount for, spending time on the call with the IT support, but it doesn't actually dive into the lost opportunity and, lost potential for other patients.
Yeah. And to take it one step further, it really reflects on that site as a whole. And so a patient isn't looking at that coordinator and that tablet and saying that tablet belongs to sponsor XYZ and it's their fault this didn't work.
Right.
That tablet is in the hands of that nurse, and that nurse belongs to this practice. And if that doesn't work, and now my time is wasted as a patient, that I'm thinking, oh, I don't know if I want to be here anymore. And so now you're jeopardizing not only this specific study, that patient's view of clinical trials as a whole, but also future potential business of that patient utilizing that doctor just for their regular care.
Yep.
And that could have been a longstanding patient for that doctor also. And so that has a larger impact. And so again, just going back to, I want to make this as easy as possible for these coordinators and for these sites, but also I don't want to embarrass them. And so it's not only I want to educate them so they could speak intelligently about the study, but I want to make sure that everything I'm asking them to use works perfectly. And if it doesn't, I need to make it right as soon as possible.
Thanks for listening to part 2 of our series with Scott Burgher. In the next and final episode, Scott looks at where AI actually helps recruitment and where feasibility still gets it wrong. If you have questions about the episode, contact us through our website at innovatingclinicaltrials.com. Follow the Innovating Clinical Trials podcast on LinkedIn and on your favorite streaming service. While you're there, give us a like. The Innovating Clinical Trials podcast is hosted by Liam Eves and Ted Trafford and is produced by Tarini Chagurthy. Opinions expressed are those of the participants and not their respective employers.